Good morning or afternoon or evening or whenever you may be watching this. My name is Alex. I'm a PhD candidate studying creative writing and literary studies, and today I am going to be talking about the Trickster character type and how we might find it in queer young adult fiction. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm recording this presentation on Ngunnawal land, and I'd like to extend my respects to the traditional owners of this country on which I undergo my research. I'd also like to say before I begin that obviously, while the circumstances of this conference going digital and virtual are obviously not ideal, I am grateful and excited for the opportunity to be here and to be able to engage with this international research community from all the way down under. I would also like to apologise in advance if I'm not able to attend the live panel discussion of this. I'd like to, but at time of recording, I am in the final months of my doctoral thesis, so I might be a bit all over the place. If you do want to reach out with questions or have a chat about my research or anything else in the conference, you're welcome to contact me on that Twitter account I have on the screen there. And I'm very much looking forward to watching everyone else's panels and presentations, and I hope that you find what I'm presenting here today useful and valuable in the same way that I'm sure I'll find a lot of value in the rest of this conference. So, what I'm presenting today draws from that aforementioned doctoral research and aims to explore the potential queer adolescent resonance of the trickster. I'll explore how those key trickstery characteristics of liminality, agency, and playful rebellion may help it to ring true to these audiences, and I'll examine a few examples of YA with queer protagonists that embody trickster traits or use trickster tactics to progress through their stories. So, as I'm sure you have gathered from across the rest of this conference, the Trickster is a kind of flexible character type that has come in many shapes and forms over the years, and the precise definition may vary from scholar to scholar. For brevity and clarity, in today's paper I'll mostly be drawing from the work of Helena Basil Morozov, whose study charts the evolution of this figure from its roots in mythology through to definitions based more in contemporary popular culture. Beginning in the mythological tradition with famous figures like the Norse Loki and the classical Greek Hermes, the trickster has evolved through time and media, with the method and modes changing while the same core components and functions of the character essentially remain. Basil Morozov states that while most scholars agree that the trickster figure serves as a chaos-inducing element intent on challenging the order of things. She also defines the distinction between the character types past and present thus: whereas mythological tricksters fight with personified representations of the deterministic principle, Zeus, Odin, Thor, contemporary cinematic tricksters attempt to cause socio-political Ragnarök. The idea of socio-political Ragnarök is a useful one for understanding the resonance the trickster type has with both queer and adolescent storytelling. A sense of playful rebellion, a struggle for agency, a troubling of perceived social norms, and an engagement with liminality are all crucial to the character type and the role and function they may play both in text and more metatextually. So, what makes the trickster potentially resonant with queer narratives? Firstly, there is plenty of room for going back to our roots and reading trickster tales from mythology through a queer lens. There are plenty of examples of tricksters changing their physical sex through shape-shifting magic, perhaps the most famous of which is the story of Loki transforming into a mare to seduce a workhorse away from its post and help the gods of Asgard win a bet. As you do. This interaction leads to Loki, normally male, becoming the mother of the foal Sleipnir. This shape-shifting ability, combined with the trickster's characteristic crossing of boundaries and troubling of binaries, makes a queer, and especially a trans or genderqueer, reading or reinterpretation of the archetype quite easy and deeply interesting. Although most of the trickster gods famous through mythology are gendered male, Delden Ann McNeely counters that the trickster is an androgynous archetype which is portrayed universally as masculine. As well as the potential for reading pre-existing trickster tales through a queer lens, the trickster also rings queer on a more thematic level. Tricksters are associated with in-between spaces. By nature, they sit outside the power structure of whatever story they may inhabit. Mythologist Lewis Hyde describes them as the god of the threshold and discusses how this is such an important characteristic of their storytelling function that a trickster who gains power within the social structure of the world they inhabit ceases to be a trickster, where the dominant social structure and set of social expectations is cis heteronormativity. Members of the LGBTQIA+ community are thus marginal. And as well as their marginality, tricksters are associated with mischief, play, and rebellion. And queerness too, particularly queer pride and expressions of that, is also heavily associated with playful rebellion, a skewing of traditional norms and expectations, and, as Jack Halberstam put it, a celebration of what maybe more normative social narratives might see as failure. So as well as the potential for reading tricksters queerly, there is also a broader thematic queer resonance in this idea of a rebellious, mischievous outsider figure who is able to trouble and topple existing power structures precisely because they stand outside of them. A figure associated with liminality, boundary crossing, and binary troubling is a character type rife with playful potential for queer storytelling. As Basil Morozov states, for centuries the trickster has been used in various narratives, including mythological, literary, and cinematic, to convey the idea of agency and rebellion, and often turbulent progress. That sense of agency or rebellion, coupled with the trickster's characteristic liminality, makes the character type not only resonant with queer storytelling, but with adolescent fiction. The trickster lends itself neatly to the young adult field because YA narratives are so often about liminality. Adolescence itself is a liminal period. As Kylie Orton writes, liminality describes a state of being in between, and adolescent characters are in between childhood and adulthood. Because they're located in the liminal, YA narratives are also often concerned with agency, with coming-of-age stories involving a search for a cohesive sense of self and a sense of control over one's life. This narrative arc often inevitably deals with identity, gender, sexuality, and the tension between adult expectations of the teenage character and the exploration and expression of their true self. There is also often a tension between the adolescent character's desire for autonomy and the adult authorities that deny it to them, whether those are literal and personal, like a parent, or perhaps more symbolic, like a dystopian government. Depends on what genre you're in. A young person is by nature an underdog protagonist, caught between, outside of, and beyond dominant power structures and enforced binaries. This structural liminality applies to a marginalized, for example a queer, young person even more so. This is a key element that makes stories about their empowerment and their triumph rewarding and rebellious. And trickster tales, of course, are also concerned with agency. This includes agency both over themselves and over the world. Laurie Landay defines the pop cultural tricksters in her study by, quote, their pursuit of autonomy, and Terry Waddell defines a trickster by their story role as an archetypal agent of change. The joy of a coming-of-age narrative is that they frequently centre these liminal characters who tend not to have much agency, and place them in a unique position to fight, or trick, their way to power through non-traditional pathways and sneak around the dominant power frameworks. So there is room aplenty for Basil Morozov's idea of socio-political Ragnarök in fiction starring and aimed at teenagers, and where this intersects with the historically playful, rebellious, and marginal field of queer fiction, the appeal and potential of a trickster here becomes clear. So YA tricksters may come in a variety of shapes and sizes. For today I want to focus on a couple of texts that I feel embody different trickster aspects, to provide a tasting platter of sorts of the ways that this character might be used in YA stories. To keep things nice and sort of straightforward, let's begin looking at a contemporary retelling of or remixing of a trickster character from myth. Loki, perhaps the poster child that most people might think of when they think of a trickster god, depicted here as a queer adolescent. Mackenzie Lee's novel is actually a tie-in for the Marvel Cinematic Universe and draws on previous iterations of Loki in various comic continuities. So it's certainly not the first or only place a queer Loki, or even Marvel's Loki, has been seen, but it does make for a useful case study. So Lee's Loki, as a teen version of the iconic trickster god, is an extra step outside the powers that be. Here, Odin does not just represent the deterministic principle, in Basil Morozo's words, but is Loki's overbearing and curmudgeonly dad. Loki seeks power and recognition among the gods of Asgard, but of course cannot achieve this, because then he would cease to be a trickster, and through his own folly ends up with an even greater outsider status when he is banished to Earth. Temporarily, of course. It's a prequel. Gotta fit into that continuity. Loki must use cleverness and wit, deception and shapeshifting to navigate power structures in unfamiliar worlds that he finds himself in. Lee's prose gives him a snarky sense of observational humour that brings out that playful, trickstery humour, as well as making the narrative voice convincingly young. Crucially for considering this as a queer interpretation of the pre-existing myths, Loki's gender fluidity is made text rather than subtext. Loki is referred to by he/him pronouns throughout the book, however he transforms into female forms multiple times for the purpose of disguise. He also shows an affinity for more feminine-coded titles and dress codes, wearing high-heeled boots and enjoying the idea of being named an enchantress or a witch. When asked about his shapeshifting between masculine and feminine presentation, Loki clarifies, quote, "I don't change my gender, I exist as both." It's this self-identification that elevates the character from simply being playful and gender non-conforming to explicitly identifying himself outside of the binary, which is very exciting. So Loki presents to us a place to play with and remix the trickster and fantasy, but trickster tactics and trickster spirit are also present in the protagonists of realist fiction. So Felix, eponymous hero of Case and Callender's Felix Ever After, is a less literal magical trickster while still employing many trickster tactics. The novel is a mystery of sorts, with Felix on a quest to reveal and bring justice to the anonymous bully who outs Felix as transgender with a so-called art gallery of photos of him pre-transition. To undergo his investigation, Felix performs a sort of digital shape-shifting, creating a false online persona and working to befriend his suspects and weasel information out of them. Felix is liminal in many ways and finds himself at various crossroads of identity throughout the novel. His status as a scholarship student means he's from a different background to his circle of rich art school classmates, and he wonders if his race marks him as one marginalisation too many. Felix Ever After is a particularly interesting example of queer YA because it examines and unpacks the power structures inherent in the supposedly inclusive space of the queer community. Even among a marginalised group, certain figures are pushed yet further to the margins. The fact that Felix is trans and black places him simultaneously in and out within the community of his queer peers. And crucially, the villain of the piece is revealed to be a white cisgender gay character, motivated by resentment that people like Felix are, quote, taking our space. So Felix is rendered powerless and vulnerable in the daylight world, but when he employs his trickster tactics in the strange in-between space that is the internet, he is able to gain some ground. However, in classic trickster style, he also gets in far over his head and shenanigans ensue. As Michael P. Cowher writes, tricksters are simultaneously selfish buffoon and culture hero, and Felix spends some time as one before emerging as the other, having fought for his own agency and changed the social makeup of his prestigious art school where the bullying took place. And finally, I want to get a little abstract and suggest that a story in itself may have trickster qualities, even if there's no single character in the cast who might embody the trickster type. For example, the YA speculative fiction works of M.K. England, spacefaring adventure the disasters, and sci-fi fantasy genre blend Spellhacker. They both feature tight-knit, fire-forged groups of marginalised teenagers placed in the crossfire by corrupt governments and greedy corporations, respectively. The antagonists are adults in positions of power and authority, eager to maintain a status quo that serves their interests, and cover up their own misdeeds and mistakes by setting the blame on these children who lack the social currency to fight back. And yet, fight back is what England's protagonists do, with a characteristically mischievous tone to the humour and action of both books. They're also very queer texts, not only in that they feature characters on the LGBTQIA+ spectrum, but in that they centre on non-normative kinships like found family and polyamorous relationships. By the standards of both speculative worlds, these are characters who have failed and fallen through the cracks. And yet, if we return to Halberstam, there is a queer art to failure that ought to be celebrated. While the antagonistic powers that be never explicitly come after these young people because they are queer or otherwise marginalised, their non-normativity stands in sharp contrast to the dominant social expectations the antagonists represent, and a clear allegory for otherness versus acceptable normativity is present that will resonate with queer adolescent readers. These narratives about messy, kind of morally grey heroes pushed to the margins, finding ways to play with the boundaries put up around them, ultimately undermining those powers that be and shaking up the established order with an unmissable sense of humour, rings true to both a greater sense of queer playfulness and a sense of trickster energy, even if you can't pinpoint a single trickster character from within those texts. Maybe the text itself is the trickster, or at least the one with trickster vibes, which will speak to the sensibilities of the intended readership. So that is just a handful of examples of how various characters may cause various forms of Ragnarok in their own contexts, whether the system they're attempting to navigate and disrupt is a comic book version of Asgard, a fancy art school, or a corrupt sci-fi corporation. I will leave you there, and I hope you have found this interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to checking out the rest of this conference. Thank you so much for listening.